Well, good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to this event on peace building and addressing gender-based violence in conflict settings. My name is Gillian Wiley. I'm Associate Professor in International Peace Studies at Trinity College Dublin, and it's a great pleasure to be the chair for this event. The global security landscape is growing increasingly fractured. The world is experiencing more armed conflicts than at any moment since World War II. In these settings, gender-based violence continues to emerge, not only as a consequence of conflict, but also as a deliberate tactic of war. Against this backdrop, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, now celebrating its 25th anniversary, remains a very crucial framework for promoting gender equality in conflict prevention, peace building, and post-conflict recovery. However, despite all the international commitments to this agenda, there's a persistent gap between policy and practice, including when it comes to addressing conflict-related sexual violence and delivering justice and support for survivors. So to discuss this really important topic this morning, we're very delighted to be joined by Commissioner Katerina Levchenko, who is the Ukrainian Government Commissioner for Gender Equality Policy. She's joining us online, as is Mary Fitzgerald, researcher, policy analyst, and consultant who is affiliated with the Middle East Institute in Washington, DC, and an expert on Libya. Aisling Swain, Professor of Peace and Security and International Law at the Sutherland School of Law at University College Dublin, and Katrina Dowd, Assistant Professor at the School of Politics and International Relations, also in University College Dublin. So just a little bit about the format this morning. Each of the speakers is going to talk for 5 to 7 minutes, followed by short panel discussion and then questions and answers with the audience, both in the room and online. So to those of you in the room, you're able to ask the panelists questions by raising your hands, and there will be a microphone brought around the room. For those of you who are online, you're also very welcome. And you can submit questions by the function on your screen. Please send questions during the session, and they'll be brought to my attention on this iPad beside me. And whenever you're asking questions, whether you're in the room or online, it would be great if you could identify yourself and any affiliation you have when you ask your question. Just a reminder to everyone that today's presentation and the questions and answer session are both being recorded. And we'd love it if you could join the discussion on Twitter. The handle is @IIEA. And that, I think, is all the housekeeping. So we can now turn to our first speaker, who is Mary Fitzgerald. And Mary, as was said, is a researcher, a policy analyst, and a consultant working in the Middle East Institute in Washington, DC. She's also a journalist who has written in many esteemed publications and a fellow in many universities around Europe and research institutes, with her specialization on Libya, and she's recently been writing a blog for Friends of Europe on the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. So she's going to introduce the WPS agenda and give us her thoughts. Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm actually calling in from Bucharest, where many people are very happy with the election results here this morning. But it's a pleasure to be with you and to discuss this very important and indeed timely topic. This year, later this year in October, is the 25th anniversary of the UN's Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which was launched, embedded in UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So it's a really good time to kind of take stock of where we are 25 years later, what has been achieved, what is yet to be done. But it's also a very timely conversation in that I would argue that the Women, Peace and Security, or WPS agenda, as espoused in that resolution 25 years ago, is threatened and imperiled in so many ways, unprecedented ways right now. Just very recently, Pete Hegseth dismantled the WPS program within the US Department of Defense. And the statement he issued following this decision, he claimed that this was a quote unquote woke, divisive agenda that was unpopular with what he called troops and was driven by what he said were feminists and left-wing activists. Extraordinary language by a senior official in the Trump administration. And we also see with the rise of authoritarian and populist governments across the world, threats and risks to this agenda like never before. I often make the point that I had an early experience, as indeed did many of us on the island of Ireland, of WPS before it became WPS, and that was with the emergence of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition during the Northern Ireland peace process. I was a teenager at that time, later as a fledgling journalist in Belfast, got to know Monica Wick-Williams, Jane Morris, and others who founded the Women's Coalition. And the fact that they insisted on a place at the table during the Northern Ireland peace process, the issues that they pushed for in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, you know, I think one can argue that their presence at the table really made the Good Friday Agreement what it became. So it was a very, very important role, and this predated WPS as a concept, as an idea espoused by the UN. But I would argue that while we've seen a lot of rhetoric, a lot of lip service to the WPS agenda over the years, we've seen over 100 countries adopt national plans to implement UN Security Council Resolution 1325. We've kind of seen quite a disconnect between that rhetoric and action on the ground. I would say that one of the big failures, if you like, is the fact that women are still absent from so many peace processes across the world. I would also say that, and this is interesting in terms of how the conversation in Europe on WPS is shifting, as we know, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the conversation in Europe about Europe's defense, foreign policy, et cetera, it's become more hard-nosed, very much more realpolitik. And with that, I certainly detect in conversations in Brussels and elsewhere a kind of a move more towards looking at WPS in terms of security and defense, so a focus on the role of women in militaries, et cetera, and a move away from a focus on what we might call the peace component of WPS, conflict resolution, peace building. And that one of the questions I would pose in terms of our discussion is, how do we strike a balance in that between a focus on the security and defense aspect, I'm talking about the European conversation on WPS now, and the conflict resolution and peace building. Another recurrent question is that of representation. We have a serious underrepresentation problem still across the board, and also I think that one of the issues in recent years is that, and certainly that I've picked up on in Libya and other places, is so in Europe and North America in recent years, there's been a lot of talk about what people refer to as a feminist foreign policy. We've seen governments in Europe, the Swedish government was the first to say that theirs is a feminist foreign policy. There's since been a rowing back on this. And I have to say that this has sometimes sat uneasily with me for a number of reasons. Number one, much of it to my eyes has seemed rather performative in terms of using this kind of language and not really backing it up. But also, I think language like feminist foreign policy in certain places tends to shut down more conversations than it opens up. And Libya is certainly a place, socially conservative country, where that certainly is the case. And one of the things I would be a little concerned about in recent years is that I've seen sometimes WPS is conflated with what people hear about a feminist foreign policy. But also what we've seen over the last 2 years, and I think this poses a very real challenge in terms of the spaces that would otherwise be well disposed to the idea of WPS, and indeed within WPS circles and spaces themselves, is accusations of double standards, particularly over the war in Gaza. It's been very striking to see otherwise strong proponents of WPS in Europe remain painfully muted, let's just say, when it comes to this aspect of the war in Gaza. And that has led to inevitable, in my view, accusations of double standards, particularly from female activists in the Middle East, in Africa, and Asia, and elsewhere. We've seen how, and I've heard many stories about the rifts over the Gaza war and perceptions of double standards within WPS-related organizations. So that's another important conversation to have. But I would like to finish my remarks with a positive note and one recent experience I saw of really a woman driving more inclusive peace building, getting women involved, and then that resulting in a government, a unity government with more female ministers. And that was in Libya in recent years, following a ceasefire that was agreed in 2020, bringing an end to 6 years of civil conflict. You had a UN dialogue process led by the acting UN envoy at the time, Stephanie Williams, who pushed for more women to be involved in that dialogue process. And around a quarter of the participants were women in the end. And Stephanie pushed for that in the face of a lot of opposition from socially conservative male politicians in Libya, male politicians and other male leaders and representatives who had successfully persuaded previous UN envoys, all of them male, that women had no right or there was no need to include women in any peace process in Libya. And many of those male UN envoys or ambassadors kind of bought that argument. Stephanie didn't, and pushed for women to be represented. The women were very vocal in that dialogue process, pushed for different things to be on the table in terms of a unity government. And this led to the appointment of a unity government where women held key portfolios. So the Justice Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, etc. So that's a recent example of a woman who is committed to the WPS agenda, pushing for inclusive peace building, and that resulting in tangible outcomes where women are better represented. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was really an interesting set of remarks that really set the wider WPS agenda, where we're at after 25 years, and particularly the challenges that the current international political system sets for trying to realize the goals of WPS. So I think that sets a really good, thank you for ending on a hopeful note as well, sets a very good context for the remarks that will come from our other speakers. Passing now to Professor Aisling Swain. As I said, she's the Professor of Peace, Security and International Law at the Sutherland School at UCD. And she's currently as well working, the possessor of a €2 million consolidator grant from the European Research Council, working on understanding gender-based violence, specifically coercive control in relation to Northern Ireland and WPS. So Aisling, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Hello, everybody. And thanks very much to the IIEA for convening the panel and inviting me to be part of it. I'm just going to make a couple of remarks around the idea and the issue of conflict-related violence against women in the context of the trajectory of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And certainly 2025 and the anniversary of the resolution is an opportune time for us to do so. And also because of the broader environment, I think, that we're all operating in right now, and the ardent pushback really that is presenting itself around the normative foundations of the very agenda itself. So I was actually involved in some of the work behind the scenes in the 2015 anniversary of Women, Peace and Security with UN Women. At the time, the Secretary General presented a report to the United Nations on progress towards implementation of the resolution. And I'm mentioning it because it was a really interesting moment, because the report itself was quite bold in acknowledging the tensions that were mentioned previously, but which the agenda has had to straddle since its inception. And on the one hand, that's the idea that women, peace and security should be and is part of this international security apparatus. And on the other, that this is a development and human rights issue. The report stated, and I think clarified that debate for us by stating that Resolution 1325 is a women's rights resolution. It was quite a bold statement to make. It was trying to wade in and say that this is where this agenda came from women's organisations. And I mentioned that today as a reminder to us that despite the direction the world is travelling, despite all of the tensions around gender equality right now in the global scene, for me, whether idealistic or not, I hold on to the idealism that this is about sustaining women's rights, and that we need to really bear that in mind as we move forward. So with that as my starting point, I'm just going to mention a couple of things. First, where we started from with this agenda on violence against women, then where we're at currently, and some ideas maybe for going forward. After Resolution 1325 was adopted, there was a big debate about having a standalone resolution on sexual violence. The majority of women's organisations at the time didn't want it. They said it would push us towards a victimisation agenda of women, that it would bring us into a space of just looking at women as victims rather than that participation element which underpins the first resolution. I would say kind of in the round, what happened over time was that is what happened initially. There was a push and a move towards nominating women's victimisation and a preoccupation at the council and otherwise around strategic rape. This is the violence that women experience. This is the thing that we need to be preoccupied by. There was more and more work by women's organisations and lots of researchers globally to say, yes, that's important. And I think the movement of these resolutions has been significant in bringing visibility to conflict-related sexual violence and the ways that women experience those forms of violence. But there's another piece where we moved from that into discovering and showing that visibility should open up space to see more, that there's other forms of harm, there's other ways that women experience conflict. We cannot conflate women's experiences of conflict with sexual violence, nor conflate their experiences of gender-based violence as only and solely strategic rape. And I think we're in a good place with that now. That trajectory has led us to a point where in the current environment, if we look at the Secretary General's report last year, the definition of conflict-related sexual violence has expanded quite a bit. We have a much more broad understanding that there is direct and indirect gendered harms happening against women in conflict. They are on the basis of gender as well as sexual orientation, and they encapsulate everything from strategic rape right across to gender-based hate speech and incitement to rape. And that's a really important move, I think, right now. So my third point then is where we're looking forward, and I want to talk a little bit about the work I've been doing on Northern Ireland. It has long been recognised that after conflict, the violence that women experience doesn't just go away. Our societies pre-conflict have endemic and tolerate certain forms of violence against women that move and shift shape during conflict and then reassert or calibrate itself after conflict. I've been looking at and talking to women who live in communities controlled by paramilitaries in Northern Ireland. And in those communities, women have talked about their experiences of intimate partner violence. Now, on the one hand, there's an argument that's an ordinary violence against women issue, nothing to do with the conflict. But actually, the way those women described it was how the perpetrators of the harm are using their paramilitary membership to enact and control the harm. So on the one level, we have paramilitaries enacting social control as gatekeepers of communities. That's traveling into the intimate relationship. For example, we have women who told me about how in the acts of harm, in the coercion and in the control in the relationship, they are using membership and telling her, I'll get the boys down, remember who I'm involved with. Another woman who described her husband introducing her to members of his gang and his group and naming them and telling them where they are monitoring and following her as she moves around in the city. And this was in the Northwest in Northern Ireland in the last 3 years. Another example of a woman who her partner brought her down a laneway and enacted a mock shooting, which is a punishment shooting, which is a practice of paramilitaries up there for contravening paramilitary practices. And another woman who talked about how in the context of the abuse, her biggest fear was the group-based capacity in the background, invisible, but visible as well at the same time. So we understand coercive control normally as a cumulative chronic harm in the context of a relationship. In a conflict-affected site, we must understand that these broader dynamics of conflict come into play in the harm. Are you doing okay? 1 minute? Okay. So With that, I think Northern Ireland is a really important lesson for us around peace building. We are 27 years post-agreement. Women are still experiencing harms related to the Troubles. And one of the key things that the WPS agenda has taught us, I think, and said to us is that we must address and have accountability for the harms during conflict. If we don't, there's consequence for after conflict. And we certainly see that in the context of Northern Ireland. So to wrap up very briefly, I think the way I draw this all together is that, you know, what the Women, Peace and Security agenda has helpfully done is open up space to create visibility and recognition, first of sexual violence, which is still needed in many armed conflicts globally, as well as then this expansion of broader harms, which we see happening over and over. And I think Katrina will talk to us about as well. But also that within that, we need to see the more subtle harms, that there is this work during and after conflict and see those connection with this. And I think that brings me back to my starting point, which is despite the current global context, despite those shifts towards militarization and the undermining of the very normative basis of women, peace and security, this idea of gender and women's rights still is very important and useful for us to see what's happening to women and try and, I suppose, shape the way that we respond to it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Aisling. That's really helpful in terms of explaining how the issues of violence have been integrated into women, peace and security, and the need for thinking more broadly about gendered harm, and very interesting research on the current situation in Northern Ireland. So thank you very much for that. Our third speaker I'm bringing in now online is Commissioner Katerina Levchenko. As mentioned, she's the Government Commissioner for Gender Equality Policy in the Ukrainian government. And she was also the founder and president of La Strada Ukraine, which is an NGO related to human trafficking and gender-based violence. So it's we're delighted you're joining us this morning, Commissioner Levchenko. I hand over to you for the next 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, good morning, dear colleagues, partners, friends, and behalf of myself and government of Ukraine, I would like to express my deep appreciation to the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin, as well as to the government and people of Ireland for hosting this important event and for their continued support of Ukraine. Accepting your invitation as a speaker, I am convinced that Ukraine's experience of resilience, women participation, recovery has a deep sense of inspiration for other countries and organizations. And this experience important not only for our today's surviving as political free nation, independent state, and vibrant civil society, it is important for our common future. And during the more than 11 years of war, the Russian Federation occupation of Russian Federation, it has committed all the crimes envisaged in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crimes of aggression. And therefore, it is a great importance for Ukraine that on May 14 this year, during its annual session in Luxembourg, the Committee of Ministers of Council of Europe reaffirmed its steadfast support for Ukraine's pursuit of justice and recovery by initiating the process of establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. One of the most serious manifestations of brutality and crimes is conflict-related sexual violence. This horrific weapon of war has been systematically used mostly by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women and girls, as well as against men and boys. Cases of CRSV are not isolated incidents. They are part of a deliberate strategy of terrorizing the population, both military and civilians. And but our survivors of sexual violence are brave, and they, both men and women, already organized several civil society organizations like SEMA Ukraine Network, Numa Sisters, alumni, and 29th of December. And together they advocate for justice and for right of survivors. And let me give you several examples of their important initiative. One of the key demands is to expand the mandate of the International Register of Damage to include crimes committed since 2014, not solely those that occurred following a Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, as it is included in mandate of this register. And this call reflects the lived experience of thousands of Ukrainians who suffering began long before 2022 and who deserve recognition, justice, and reparations. Second example, leaders of these four organizations, men and women, wrote the letter to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres with requirement to include Russia in so-called shame list annex of the UN Secretary General report on CRSV, which includes the list of military groups which already which committed sexual violence against civilians and against militaries. And the letter was received by Secretary General, and we expect his decision around the presentation of the 2024 annual report, which we expect will be during summertime. And of course, it is an individual decision of Secretary General, but support of you and your governments to achieve this goal is very important. The third example, survivors involved very deep in developing policy and implementing policy. And one of the example is the program of interim urgent reparation, which implemented in Ukraine by government in cooperation with Global Survival Fund and organizations of survivors. And to ensure the sustainable and expansion of this pilot project, it is necessary to refill the interim compensation fund. Today we have already more than 900 applications from survivors, and more than 600 of them received such small amount of money, around 3,000 euro. And we count on the continued support of our international partners in mobilizing the necessary resource to guarantee that every survivor receives dignified assistance. And the last but not least example, developing the policy together with women organizations of survivors. Now we are in the process of developing the third national action plan on UN Security Council 1325 implementations. This plan will be till the end of 2030. And such strategic goals as response to conflict-related sexual violence, as well as increasing women participation in conflict resolution and response to all threats, security threats, which we have in Ukraine, and it's like ecological, economic, in area of energy and others, will be included in this plan. And we expect that it will be adopted by government till the end of this year, and will demonstrate the strong commitments of Ukrainian government and civil society to implement the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and its sisters resolutions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Commissioner Levchenko, for those remarks that both remind us of the realities of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict, but also bring our attention to lots of civil society activism and work being done, inspired by the agenda to make space for survivors and for participants in peace processes and so on. So thank you for those remarks. we turn to our final speaker, Katrina Dowd, Assistant Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations in UCD. And her research is focusing on conflict in humanitarian crises. And currently she's leading a research project, Coalesce-funded project, on the gendered dimensions of food insecurity. So this is another aspect to thinking about gendered violence. So, Katrina.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the IIEA for welcoming us, and thank you for everyone here and online. It's a pleasure to join this very esteemed panel and talk about this. The first question I get asked when I'm appearing on a panel or in a discussion like this is, why is there someone talking about food on this panel? So I'd like to tackle that head on and make really 5 key points today. The first is that we're in the middle of a global food crisis. 300 million people are acutely food insecure. That is primarily driven by conflict, and that is profoundly gendered. When I say profoundly gendered, I mean that women and girls make up the majority of food insecure people worldwide. At the same time, male mortality is much higher in starvation conditions than it is for female counterparts. So there are both sex and gender dimensions to how food crises, largely driven today by violent conflict, are experienced and are survived. And we don't pay nearly enough attention to that. So we really want to pick up where Aisling had mentioned this idea of expanding into different domains and opening up the conversation about what does gendered harm look like in conflict, to ask, what does the weaponization of food in a gendered way look like? What do structural harms in terms of their gendered features look like in conflict? And by that I mean food systems are sites of gendered violence during and after conflict. Conflict weaponizes food in many conflicts worldwide, and there's lots of research that can co-occur alongside conflict-related sexual violence and gendered violence. So there are both systemic and more strategic elements to the use of this. The second point I want to make is that all in all, that means we should be talking about food in relation to WPS, and we're not. So fewer than half of all WPS documents, this is in research we undertook with our Research Ireland collaborators in South Africa, fewer than half of all WPS documents make any reference whatsoever to food. That means if we look at national action plans, resolutions, annual reports, and even where they do, the majority of those mention food superficially and in passing. So food is most often an example of one of several basic needs that should be addressed through humanitarian relief. And that leaves a whole lot else outside of that in terms of thinking about the gendered harm in food that isn't said and isn't addressed. And for that, I want to make my third point, which is that food is important in WPS in and of itself, but it is also a useful prism through which to recognize and identify the shortcomings of the WPS agenda so far, and to point us towards where we need to go if it is to survive and expand in the next 25 years. And by that, I mean that when we look at what the references to food in the WPS agenda, it is emblematic of those shortcomings we see in other domains of the WPS agenda. It tells us something about who the woman is that WPS is talking about. The woman who is imagined by WPS when those documents talk about food is primarily a mother. So she is a mother of young children, because that is the primary role in which women are conceived of in terms of their nutritional and food needs. She is primarily a recipient or a beneficiary of food assistance. She is not, for example, a food system actor with much agency. I was speaking to a colleague doing terrific work in Trinity College Dublin on women in peacebuilding in Haiti, where Mad and Sarah are a critical part of an almost paralyzed food system. They are trader transporters who operate in and around peri-urban areas and keep that food system functioning in a time where that country is facing immense food crisis. The research we did with Concern Worldwide on that in Port-au-Prince. And those kinds of roles, active agents in food systems, are nowhere to be seen in this discussion. So when we think about the woman who is hungry or who is even imagined in relation to food in WPS, we're not talking about former combatants. We're not talking about women in urban areas, human rights defenders in urban areas who have the right to food. We're primarily talking about rural mothers of young children who work on the land. And that leaves a whole range of women with different or no caring responsibilities, with different profiles, who are left out of that conversation. And I think it goes to our NGO partners as much as it does to researchers and policymakers to say this very clearly: women are bearers of the right to food in their own capacity, and not only as conduits for household nutrition, for example. If we give women food, then their children will be healthier and fuller. And I think that's an important point that we need to challenge for all of our understandings of women in relation to food rights. The fourth is that when we compare global policy in WPS with what women in actual conflicts are saying, it's really illustrative of where this divide in terms of what food looks like. And I know our colleagues are here from Colombia today. Our esteemed colleagues have joined. Another colleague at the university, the Catholic University of Bogota, has conducted an analysis with me looking at what civil society organizations led by women said in the run-up to the peace agreement in Colombia about food. And where the WPS global agenda is talking about recipients, talking about aid, talking about humanitarian relief, women's organizations in Colombia very explicitly say that in the enjoyment of the right to food, the fulfillment of that is a precondition for the enjoyment of a full political life. I want to say that again, that it is not only about meeting basic human needs for survival, it is about freeing women up and liberating them in order to enjoy the full conditions of a fully political life in all of its dimensions. And I think that brings me to my fifth point, which is I think food tells us something about where to go in terms of WPS agenda. And that is that as we're facing, as Mary said, this agenda is threatened and imperiled. It's facing this enormous backlash and this pushback on the core fundamentals. I think all of us who care about WPS, who care about peace building, who care about conflict-related sexual violence and ending it, need to ask, do we hold firm on some core principles, or do we continue this aim to advance and push into new domains? And I think asking ourselves, and Aisling mentioned this as well, asking ourselves, where do women's organizations worldwide want that emphasis to be is what we should be asking. Because it's not for us to say that an agenda that after 25 years I think still has failed to be ambitious enough, we should contract and restrict our ambitions even further. Because women's organizations recognize the political nature of resources, the political nature of power, that these are fundamentally political questions. And every time I question, well, if we're seeing cutbacks in even life-saving gender-based violence programming, is it the right time to be pushing to say we need to expand and recognize food, for example? I only have to remind myself that women's organizations worldwide don't see those things as different. Those are essential components of the full enjoyment of women's full political and human rights. So thank you so much.